The air in the courtroom vibrated with palpable tension, an expectant silence, almost cruel. The morning light, filtering through the Gothic windows, fell upon the bruised face of a woman who, despite the shackles adorning her wrists and the evident injustice of her situation, radiated a disturbing calm. She was Keisha Williams, and her gaze, fixed on the shifty eyes of Officer Martinez, promised a storm. A purplish bruise bloomed on her left cheek, a mute testimony to the brutality she had suffered just hours earlier on the very steps of justice. Yet in her eyes there was no trace of fear, only an iron determination, almost a hidden mockery. The temporary substitute judge, Harrison, a pale and frail man whose robe hung too large on him, seemed impatient to be done with this formality, this waste of time that was listening to the accused. The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, a middle-aged woman with an immaculate hairstyle, looked at Keisha with a mixture of condescending pity and professional disdain. Both were convinced of the narrative they had just heard, the polished and calculated version of Officer Martinez, the hero of the day. But Keisha knew that truth, like an underground river, always finds its way to the surface, and hers was about to overflow. The courtroom, on the verge of witnessing one of the most dramatic role reversals in judicial history, was not prepared for the voice about to fill the space, a voice that would not merely speak but dictate destiny. Officer Martinez, a man with a square jaw and a perpetual smile of self-satisfaction, had cleared his throat before taking the stand, an experienced actor on the stage of lies. He had rehearsed this role countless times. The audience, mostly court employees who had heard similar stories, watched with an unsettling familiarity. "Your Honor," Martinez began, his voice firm and well-modulated, a model of professionalism. "I was carrying out routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach court security." His gaze turned toward Keisha, chained to the defendant's table, the bruise on her face the only vibrant color in her somber attire. The defendant was acting erratically, refused to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Harrison, nodding, leaned forward, a puppeteer absorbed in his marionette. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Martinez?" the judge asked, his thin voice echoing in the room. Martinez, in his element, continued, his eyes gleaming with an unhinged enthusiasm. "Well, sir," she was dressed inappropriately for a judicial proceeding, and she was carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents. His words, like silk threads, wove a web of deceit. "When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanities and uttering threats." From the gallery, Officers Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed Martinez's performance many times, different faces, the same script. "She kept yelling that she was someone important," Martinez went on, his voice dripping with disdain. "These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor." Judge Harrison leaned back, visibly intrigued. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest?" "Absolutely. The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum force necessary to ensure public safety." Martinez's hand trembled almost imperceptibly, the only crack in his flawless performance. The court stenographers, like diligent spiders, wove every lie for posterity, their fingers flying over their keyboards. In the last row, a young law intern frowned. Something in the story didn't fit protocol. "Officer Rodriguez," the prosecutor called, "can you corroborate Officer Martinez's testimony?" Rodriguez stood, his uniform immaculate. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to evade security protocols. Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Harrison asked. Martinez's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I only used the force necessary to subdue an aggressive individual who was threatening court security. The defendant's injuries, if any, resulted from her own resistance to lawful orders. He pulled out his phone, swiping to show a video that conveniently began in the middle of the confrontation. I have partial footage here, though unfortunately my body camera malfunctioned this morning. The lie slid off his tongue like honey. How convenient, Keisha murmured, speaking for the first time. Pardon? Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. Nothing, Your Honor, she replied calmly, though her eyes burned with contained fury, waiting for the exact moment to unleash her vengeance. Martinez continued his act. What we're seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents, and, when confronted with her criminal behavior, immediately claimed discrimination. Prosecutor Walsh nodded sympathetically. Officer Martinez, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes. There's a pattern here. Certain people believe they're above the law, that the rules don't apply to them. They use accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal behavior. Martinez's voice rose with righteous indignation. It's frankly an insult to the real victims of discrimination. Several people in the gallery, mostly white court employees, nodded, recognizing a familiar narrative. The defendant claims she was coming to work, Martinez made air quotes with his fingers, but she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason to be in a restricted court area. Thompson, the third officer, stepped forward. If I may, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. We suspected she might have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme. Judge Harrison looked intrigued. Fraud scheme? Yes, sir. Martinez jumped in again, sensing the tide in his favor. These documents bore judicial letterhead, case numbers, and sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel. The irony was so thick it nearly choked the air, but Martinez, oblivious to the trap he was weaving for himself, pressed on. In my professional opinion, he concluded, this is just another case of someone trying to manipulate the system. She knows that if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. He turned to look directly at Keisha, his eyes cold and full of contempt. These people think they can just walk into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my court. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several court employees shifted uncomfortably, while others remained impassive. Your Honor, added Prosecutor Walsh, the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate defense strategy. Martinez gave a small smile. Everything was going exactly as planned. The courtroom's pulse slowed. Keisha, despite the handcuffs marking her wrists and the indignity of her position, rose with unmistakable dignity. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery as she stood, her movement graceful, almost ethereal. The bruise on her cheek, far from diminishing her, only accentuated the gravity of her expression. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear, controlled, resonating with an authority that surprised everyone and filled every corner of the room. I appreciate the opportunity to address these accusations. Judge Harrison blinked. Something in Keisha's tone was unexpected, professional, a stark contrast to the narrative he'd been fed. First, I'd like to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Martinez's testimony. Keisha's eyes swept the room methodically, pausing on each person who had backed the officer's lies. A silent roster of the guilty. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk, approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, I'm certain you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in HGV v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present. The stenographer's fingers paused mid-transcription. The usual clatter of typewriters abruptly ceased. The prosecutor frowned. This was not the incoherent emotional outburst they expected from someone facing serious charges. Furthermore, Keisha continued with a calm that disarmed, Officer Martinez testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely. She gestured to the evidence table where her scattered papers had been collected, now piled carelessly as proof of her alleged crime. Those documents are, in fact, authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Harrison interrupted, a note of suspicion in his voice. And what exactly is your profession, Miss? Keisha paused, a faint smile touching the corners of her mouth. Williams. Dr. Williams. And I believe we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. A chill ran down Martinez's spine. Something was very wrong with this scene, a dissonance he couldn't pinpoint. Your Honor, if I may continue, Keisha said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone completely at ease in a judicial setting. Officer Martinez also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanities. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the alleged incident. She paused, letting the words sink in. However, I will note that any statements I made were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. The young law intern in the back row straightened, a spark of recognition in her memory. Something about this woman's voice, her demeanor, felt strangely familiar. Now, regarding the officer's claim that his body camera malfunctioned, Keisha continued, and now there was steel in her voice. Your Honor, I'm certain you're familiar with the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows the introduction of summaries of voluminous records. I have reason to believe complete video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be available to this court. Judge Harrison leaned forward. What sort of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse is equipped with extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main entrance. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body camera recordings, regardless of alleged equipment failures. The color drained from Martinez's face. He had forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his haste to control the narrative. I would like to formally request, Keisha continued, her voice as cold as the metal, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 and 9:05 a.m., including but not limited to courthouse security footage, body camera backup files, and any cell phone recordings made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Walsh stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Keisha turned to look at the prosecutor with an expression that made the woman take an involuntary step back. Your Honor, pro se defendants have a constitutional right under the Sixth Amendment to present evidence in their own defense. Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases usually went. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Miss Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Keisha's reply was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something almost like amusement. She moved toward the evidence table as far as the handcuffs allowed and pointed to her scattered belongings. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Martinez's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized. She indicated a specific document among the papers. This is my daily court calendar showing that I was scheduled to I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate matters starting at 9:00 a.m. this morning. The bailiff, a large man named Henderson who had worked in this courthouse for 12 years, suddenly froze. He stared at Keisha with growing recognition and horror. Officer Martinez testified that I claimed to be someone important, Keisha continued. I'd like to clarify that I never made such a claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. She paused, scanning the room. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Martinez's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being in this courthouse this morning. Judge Harrison, his face now a map of growing discomfort, asked in a strained voice, "What sort of documentation?" Keisha, with deliberate slow movements so as not to alarm anyone, carefully reached into her jacket pocket. My judicial parking pass, issued by this court's administrative office, my building access card programmed with my entry code to my judicial chambers, and my official identification. Bailiff Henderson, pale as wax, stood abruptly, recognition hitting him like lightning. He had seen her every day for the past 3 years, her commanding figure entering through those same doors. Your Honor, Keisha said softly, but with a resonance that carried throughout the room, I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding about exactly who Officer Martinez assaulted this morning. She lifted a leather credential wallet, and from across the room the golden judicial seal was unmistakably visible. Perhaps we should take a recess so that proper identifications can be verified, she suggested, her voice taking on the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to giving orders in courtrooms, not receiving them. Judge Harrison stared at the credential wallet, then at Keisha's face, then at the bailiff, who nodded grimly. The court will recess for 15 minutes, he said in a hoarse voice. As the gavel fell, Martinez felt his world beginning to crumble around him. Whatever game he thought he was playing, he was starting to realize he might not understand the rules at all. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Keisha sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he realized the gravity of the situation. Judge Williams, he whispered, his voice filled with horror. My God, Judge Williams. I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that. It's all right, Henderson, Keisha replied gently. You weren't part of this, but I need you to do something for me. Anything, Your Honor, anything. I need you to go quietly to my chambers and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with gold trim. And Henderson, she looked him directly in the eyes, bring my gavel too, the one engraved from my swearing-in ceremony. Henderson nodded vigorously and hurried off, leaving Keisha alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself the way she had learned to do over her 23 years on the bench. That morning, she had been Judge Keisha Williams, respected jurist, protector of constitutional rights, guardian of justice. In the span of 15 minutes, she had been transformed into a victim, an accused, a shackled woman facing false charges. But now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned, buzzed with missed calls and messages. Her assistant, Janet Morrison, had sent increasingly frantic texts. Judge Williams, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Judge Williams, please call me back. There are rumors something happened. Keisha replied quickly. Tell the Peterson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my afternoon calendar. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she wanted. Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district. Margaret, it's Keisha. Keisha, thank God. We heard there was some incident. Are you okay? I've been better. Margaret, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without questions right now. Of course. Whatever you need. I need you to contact courthouse security and tell them to immediately preserve and copy all surveillance recordings from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Margaret, make sure multiple copies are stored in different locations. There was a pause on the line. Keisha, what exactly happened this morning? A police officer named Martinez just spent an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal trespassing on courthouse property. Keisha's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Chief Judge Carter had never heard before. And the dangerous criminal was me, Margaret. On my way to work, he didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of this courthouse, called me a filthy animal, and told me I belonged in a cage. The silence on the other end lasted nearly 30 seconds. Jesus Christ, Keisha, what do you need? Should I call the FBI, the Attorney General's office? Not yet. Right now I need those surveillance recordings secured, and I need you to make some calls. I want every case Officer Martinez has testified in over the last 5 years reviewed. Every single one. Consider it done, but Keisha, you can't handle this case yourself. There's a conflict of interest. Margaret, in about 10 minutes I'm going back into that courtroom in my judicial robes. Officer Martinez is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning and, more importantly, who has the power to ensure he faces the consequences of his actions. Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor. And your gavel. Keisha stood and unzipped the bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on, she felt the transformation begin. The fabric settled over her shoulders like a mantle of authority, each fold a reminder of the power she wielded, the oaths she had taken, the justice she was bound to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted her ceremonial gavel, its familiar weight comforting in her hand. Engraved on the handle were the words, "Justice is blind, but it sees everything." Henderson, she said, adjusting her robes, when we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me properly. Yes, Your Honor, how would you like to be announced? Keisha Williams stood to her full height, every inch the federal judge she had been for the past 23 years. The Honorable Judge Keisha Williams presiding. She looked at herself in the small wall mirror. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, but now it served a different purpose. It was no longer just evidence of Martinez's brutality. It was a symbol of how low the system had fallen and how completely it was about to be restored. When court resumed, Officer Martinez would learn what justice truly meant. All rise. Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that brought everyone to their feet. But what happened next would be etched in their memories forever. The court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Keisha Williams presiding. The words struck the room like thunder. Officer Martinez, who had been leaning casually against the prosecution table, went rigid. Judge Harrison, still seated in what he now realized was not his chair, turned deathly pale. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. Keisha Williams entered through the judge's chamber's door, dressed in her full judicial robes, the gold trim gleaming under the overhead lights. She moved with the measured cadence of someone who had walked this path thousands of times. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. The silence was absolute. Not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat slowly, deliberately. Her eyes swept the room, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Martinez," she said quietly, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "you may remain standing." Martinez looked like he was about to vomit. His face had gone from red to white to green in the span of 30 seconds. "Your Honor," Judge Harrison stammered, rising from his chair. We didn't, I mean—" "Judge Harrison," Keisha interrupted, her tone sharp but not unkind. "Thank you for covering my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own calendar. I'll handle this matter." Harrison practically fled the room, his robes flapping behind him as if chased by demons. Keisha turned her attention to Martinez, who was now visibly trembling. "Officer Martinez, approximately 2 hours ago you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" I... Martinez could not form words. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Keisha continued. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Martinez nodded weakly. "You also claimed that I was, and I quote, 'another entitled activist looking for a payout,' and that you had seen, quote, 'this playbook before.' Is that accurate?" The room was so quiet, the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. "And perhaps most memorably," Keisha's voice grew colder, "you claimed that people like me need to learn that, quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom?" Martinez's legs shook so badly he could barely stand. Keisha reached beneath her bench and pulled out a sleek, modern tablet. "Officer Martinez, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." She turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. On it, in crystal clarity, played security camera footage of the courthouse steps, capturing the morning's incident from multiple angles. "This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance." Her finger tapped the screen, starting the video. The room watched in horror as events unfolded. There was Keisha, calmly walking toward the courthouse in civilian clothes. There was Martinez blocking her path, and then Martinez's voice, clear as day, filled the room through the tablet's speakers. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in." Several people gasped audibly. The video continued, showing Martinez's unprovoked assault in vivid detail. The slap that snapped Keisha's head to the side, the brutal grip on her throat, the handcuffs. But the most damning moment was yet to come. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courtrooms." Martinez's own words, spoken with such venom and hatred, echoed in his own courtroom. Several jurors from other cases waiting in the gallery stood and left, disgusted. "Officer Martinez," Keisha said, pausing the video, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Martinez remained silent, his career disintegrating before his eyes. "Now," Keisha continued, "let us examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned." She swiped to a new video file. "This is a backup recording from your own body camera, automatically uploaded to the county's cloud storage every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed." The new video began to play, and Martinez's voice filled the room again, but this time it was worse. This was the full, unedited version. "Look at this uppity one thinking she can just walk into my courthouse." Martinez's voice growled through the speakers. "These people need to learn their place. Time for another lesson." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, was frantically gathering her papers, trying to distance herself from the unfolding catastrophe. But Keisha was not finished. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson," she called. "You both testified under oath that Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to review those statements?" Both officers were already heading for the exit, their faces ashen. "And here," Keisha said, fast-forwarding the video to show Martinez's assault from his own body camera perspective, "we can see the moment Officer Martinez committed aggravated assault against a federal judge." She let those words, "federal judge," hang in the air for a moment, their impact reverberating in the silence. Martinez's knees buckled. He gripped the prosecution table to keep from collapsing. "But wait," Keisha said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "There's more." She opened a new file on her tablet. "This is audio from Officer Thompson's body camera, which apparently worked perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the room. Thompson's voice, speaking to Rodriguez as Martinez assaulted Keisha. "This guy's really letting her have it. You think she's really somebody important like she keeps saying?" Rodriguez's voice replied, "Nah, man. Look at her. Martinez knows what he's doing. Probably another welfare queen trying to scam the system." More laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. The few remaining spectators in the gallery stared at Martinez with barely concealed revulsion. "Officer Martinez," Keisha said, setting down her tablet, "you asked earlier whether I had any employment verification." She gestured to the judicial seal mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her nameplate, then to the oil portrait of herself hanging in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Martinez. Every case you've testified in, every warrant you've sought, every search you've conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority." Martinez finally found his voice, though it was barely a hoarse whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Keisha repeated slowly, her words like icy knives. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman and made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless and decided to abuse that power." She leaned slightly over the bench, her gaze locked on the now shattered officer. "But Officer Martinez, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. The silence was almost painful. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting an investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this police department, working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division." Martinez's face turned completely white, a cadaverous pallor. "This morning's incident was not random, Officer Martinez. You have been under investigation, and you have just provided us with the most perfect evidence we could have hoped for." She raised her gavel and held it before her, an emblem of immutable power. "Officer Martinez, you said that actions have consequences. You were right about that." The gavel came down with a thunderous crack. "The court will recess while I consider appropriate charges." Martinez collapsed into a chair, his career, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom hanging by a thread. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters had quietly filled the gallery, drawn by whispers of the most spectacular turn in the building's history. Martinez sat slumped in what was now clearly the defendant's chair. His uniform rumpled, his face ashen. His attorney, a nervous public defender named Michael Carter, who had been hastily summoned, cast worried glances at his client. Judge Keisha Williams returned to her bench with the same measured dignity she had shown thousands of times before, but now every eye in the room saw her differently. This was not just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutally assaulted by the man now trembling before her bench. "Officer Martinez," she began, her voice carrying the weight of 23 years of judicial authority, "before proceeding with the serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court and everyone present deserve to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood walking around the bench to address the packed courtroom directly. My name is Judge Keisha Williams. I have served as presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2001 and confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous vote. Her voice grew stronger with each word, commanding and resonant. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Martinez's attorney scribbled notes frantically, likely calculating how many years his client faced. During my tenure as a federal prosecutor, I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority. She paused, letting that concrete, devastating number sink in. In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every kind of criminal behavior, every excuse, every justification. Judge Williams walked closer to where Martinez, hunched and trembling, sat. But in all my years of service, Officer Martinez, I have never, not once, encountered a more perfect example of everything that is wrong with policing in America. The packed room was silent, broken only by Martinez's ragged breathing. You see, Officer Martinez, when you called me a ghetto rat and a filthy animal, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting any citizen. She returned to her position behind the bench, her voice laden with historic meaning. You were assaulting the person who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring officers like you are held accountable for their actions. Judge Williams opened a thick file that had been placed on her bench, its pages a silent testament to hidden truths. This file contains detailed records of every case in which you have testified over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Martinez. 43 times you have stood in my courtroom and sworn to tell the truth. She turned pages slowly, the whisper of paper amplified by the silence. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the arresting officer. And in every one of them, Officer Martinez, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. Martinez's face had gone from white to gray, his expression now a mirror of his impending fate. Acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, threatening officer safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies over and over, now exposed to the light. Judge Williams closed the file with a sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Martinez. For the past 6 months, I have been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice to investigate systemic patterns of racial bias and misconduct in this police department. The public defender stopped writing and simply stared at his client with something akin to pity. Your name, Officer Martinez, appears on a federal watch list. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed. She leaned slightly forward, her voice a whisper charged with power. And this morning, Officer Martinez, you provided us with the most perfect, unequivocal, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations any prosecutor could have hoped for. Judge Williams raised her gavel, the symbol of her absolute authority. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so explicitly based on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed perjury by lying under oath about the circumstances of that assault. The gavel hovered in the air, suspended like the sword of Damocles. Officer Martinez, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. Well, allow me to tell you exactly what my place is. Her voice filled the room with calm, commanding authority. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is done. My place is holding people like you accountable when they abuse the power we have entrusted to them. The gavel came down once, the sound reverberating with chilling finality. My place, Officer Martinez, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you ever commit as a police officer. Martinez finally understood that he hadn't just assaulted any woman. He had assaulted justice itself, and justice was about to strike back with all its fury. Officer Martinez, Judge Williams continued, opening a thick manila folder, let us examine your distinguished career in law enforcement, shall we? Martinez's attorney leaned in to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Martinez seemed paralyzed, unable to respond to anything around him. According to internal affairs records, you have been the subject of 47 formal complaints during your 15-year career. 47 complaints. Officer Martinez, that averages more than 3 complaints per year. She pulled out a document and held it up. Let's start with complaint number 1, filed in 2009. Mrs. Rosa Delgado, a 63-year-old grandmother, alleged that you called her a whore during a routine traffic stop and slammed her against the hood of her car when she asked for your badge number. The packed room shifted uncomfortably, a murmur of disbelief rippling through. Your department's investigation concluded Mrs. Delgado's allegations were unfounded. Interesting, considering we now have video evidence of you using remarkably similar language and tactics. Judge Williams turned to another page. Complaint number 12, 2012. Jamal Washington, a 17-year-old honor student, alleged that you planted drugs in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his older brother. Again, your department found the complaint unfounded. Martinez's breathing grew more labored with each revelation. Complaint number 23, 2016. Dr. Michael Johnson. Yes, Dr. Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, alleged that you arrested him outside his own home because you didn't believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Dr. Johnson spent 6 hours in jail before his attorney could secure his release. She looked directly at Martinez. What was the department's finding on that complaint, Officer Martinez? I don't... Martinez's voice was barely audible. Unfounded, Judge Williams answered for him. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Chief Judge Margaret Carter had quietly entered the courtroom and now sat in the front row, her expression grim as she took notes. But here's what's really interesting, Officer Martinez. I've cross-referenced your complaint record with your arrest statistics, and some fascinating patterns emerge. Judge Williams pulled out a large chart and placed it on an easel for all to see. Over your 15-year career, you have made 1,250 arrests. Of those arrests, 1,089, 87%, involved people of color. By contrast, the demographics of your patrol area are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. She pointed to different sections of the chart with a laser pointer. Even more interesting, your use of force reports show that you employed physical force in 63% of arrests involving people of color, compared to only 12% of arrests involving white suspects. Martinez's attorney scribbled frantically, likely preparing an insanity defense. And here is perhaps the most damning statistic of all, Judge Williams continued. Of your 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or constitutional rights violations. That's nearly a 40% dismissal rate. She turned to Martinez. Officer Martinez, do you know what we call it when a police officer has a 40% dismissal rate due to constitutional violations? We call it a pattern of criminal behavior. The room was sepulchral silent, save for the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. But wait, there's more, Judge Williams said, her tone now almost conversational. "I've also reviewed the financial impact of your career on this county's taxpayers." She pulled out another document. "Over the past 15 years, this county has paid $2.3 million in settlements and judgments related to your conduct. $2.3 million. Officer Martinez, that's more than the entire annual budget of some small towns." Martinez finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Judge Williams interrupted. "Officer Martinez, allow me to read you the oath you took when you became a police officer." She pulled out an official document and read aloud. "I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office to the best of my ability. So help me God." She set the document down. "Faithfully and impartially, Officer Martinez. Not selectively, not based on skin color, not based on your personal prejudices." Judge Williams walked around the bench again, addressing the entire room. "What we are witnessing here is not the behavior of one rogue officer. This is the inevitable result of a system that protects officers like Martinez, that dismisses complaint after complaint, that pays settlement after settlement, all while allowing the abuse to continue." She turned back to Martinez. "But that system failed you today, didn't it, Officer Martinez? Because today you chose to assault someone who had the power to expose it all." Martinez's head fell into his hands, his spirit broken. "Officer Martinez, this morning you told this court that people like me need to learn our place. Well, I think it's time you learned yours." Judge Williams returned to her bench and raised her gavel. "Your place, Officer Martinez, is in the defendant's chair, facing the full consequences of 15 years of criminal behavior." The gavel came down with a finality that sealed Martinez's fate, and that is exactly where you are going to remain. Judge Williams stood tall behind her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her like armor forged from justice itself. The packed courtroom collectively held its breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a historic verdict. "Officer Martinez," she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. "Before I pronounce sentence in this matter, I want to address not only you but everyone in this room and everyone who will hear about what happened here today." She gestured to the gallery filled with lawyers, judicial staff, reporters, and citizens drawn by whispers of the extraordinary proceedings. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when someone with a badge believes they are above the law? What happens when years of unchecked power and systemic protection create a person who thinks they can assault a federal judge and face no consequences? Martinez remained slumped in his chair, his career and life unraveling in real time. The answer, Officer Martinez, is standing before you right now. Judge Williams took her gavel, the same one engraved with the words, "Justice is blind, but it sees everything," on the day she took her oath. For 15 years, you have terrorized this community. For 15 years, you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years, you have made a mockery of the badge you swore to honor. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate as she continued. But your greatest mistake, Officer Martinez, was not any single act of brutality. Your greatest mistake was believing the system would always protect you, no matter how far you went, no matter how many lives you destroyed. Martinez finally looked up, his eyes red and helpless. This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, when you handcuffed me and paraded me through these halls like a criminal, you thought you were asserting dominance over another powerless victim. Judge Williams leaned forward, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, forcing everyone in the packed room to strain to hear her words. But I was never powerless, Officer Martinez, and neither was any of the people you have brutalized over the years. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness. She straightened to her full height. Officer Martinez, based on the evidence presented in this court, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of first-degree assault, a felony. The words struck the room like thunder. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Martinez's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal offense punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Martinez seemed to shrink further in his chair. And I find you guilty of first-degree perjury for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Judge Williams paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room. But Officer Martinez, this case was never really about you. You are merely a symptom of a far larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid settlements while allowing the abuse to continue. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice is not for them. Her voice rose with passion. But that ends today. What happened in this courtroom today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians, no one. Martinez suddenly broke down completely, his body shaking with sobs that echoed in the silent room. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant. Judge Williams looked at him with something that might have been compassion. Officer Martinez, your apology comes 15 years and 47 complaints too late. Your remorse only appears now because you were finally caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable. She raised her gavel high above her head, a final, definitive gesture. But this is what I want you to understand. In your final moments as a free man, every person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice I am delivering today. Every grandmother you insulted, every teenager you planted drugs on, every doctor you arrested for living in the wrong neighborhood. They all deserve to see you held accountable. The gavel hovered in the air, a momentary suspension of judgment. Today, I am not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unfounded. I am delivering justice for every family that had to watch their loved one brutalized while the system looked the other way. Her voice filled every corner of the room. Officer Martinez, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, allow me to tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives. The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder. Officer Martinez, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in a federal prison with no possibility of parole. Martinez collapsed completely, his sobs now uncontrollable. In addition, Judge Williams continued, I order a federal investigation into every case you have ever been involved in, every arrest you have made, and every complaint filed against you. The victims you silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court. She set down her gavel and looked at the packed room. Let this be a message to every police officer, every prosecutor, every official who believes they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but it sees everything, and it eventually comes for everyone. The room erupted in applause that lasted 5 minutes. Finally, justice had been served. 6 months later, The ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system. Officer Martinez was serving his 25-year sentence in a federal prison, where fellow inmates had learned of his crimes through news coverage. His badge, his pension, his freedom, all gone. The man who once terrorized an entire community now spent his days in protective custody, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. But Martinez Osadiu's fall was only the beginning. The federal investigation Judge Williams ordered uncovered a web of corruption that reached deep into the police department's chain of command. 12 officers were fired. 4 supervisors were criminally charged. The entire department was placed under federal oversight. Chief Judge Margaret Carter established new protocols requiring automatic federal review of any case involving allegations of police misconduct against judicial personnel. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, with backup systems that could never be disabled. Most importantly, the 432 cases Martinez had tainted were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants were released from prison. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or sentences reduced. The county paid an additional $8.7 million in compensation to Martinez's victims, money taken directly from the police department's budget. Judge Williams herself became a national symbol of judicial integrity and courage. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, sharing the story of how one moment of violence exposed decades of systemic abuse. Her message was always the same. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is justice for all. The courthouse where it all happened was renamed the Williams Federal Justice Courthouse in her honor. A bronze plaque near the entrance commemorates the morning that changed everything, with a simple inscription: "Here, justice finally found its voice." But perhaps the most powerful change was in the community itself. Citizens who had spent years afraid to report police misconduct began coming forward. Community oversight boards were established. Police training programs were completely overhauled, with Judge Williams personally designing curricula on constitutional rights and unconscious bias. The young law intern who had witnessed the proceedings that day, inspired by Judge Williams' courage, decided to specialize in civil rights law. She now works for the ACLU, fighting similar battles in courtrooms across the country. Rodriguez and Thompson, the officers who backed Martinez's lies, were fired and faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Their recorded laughter as they watched a federal judge being brutalized became evidence in a case study taught in police academies nationwide as an example of institutional corruption. The video of Judge Williams delivering her verdict became the most viewed courtroom recording in Internet history, with over 50 million views. Comments poured in from around the world, from people who had experienced similar injustices but had never seen accountability delivered so completely, so publicly, so perfectly. Today, Officer Martinez sits in his cell, likely thinking about the moment he decided to assault a woman because he thought she was powerless. He thought he knew his place in the world. He thought he knew hers. He was wrong on both counts because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice strikes back.